Rereading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein for this video essay gave me a burning question. Of all the sins and misdeeds given in the story, what was the core transgression in the book? To my mind, Victor's creation of the body of the creature was only one problem. A deeper problem lay in the failure to allow the creature to then develop a sense of humane selfhood. So I explore how this failure happened and how this vital missing component of the creature's being led to one of the great monsters of literature, one that exposes the monstrous within us. I hope you enjoy the video. In January of 1818, Mary Godwin Shelley published Frankenstein, a novel she would later call her hideous progeny. The story of an obsessive scientist taking body parts and bringing them to life, and the resulting monster who takes revenge on his master, has connected with readers for 200 years, and the book has never been out of print. But it leaves us with questions. What meaning can we draw from the story? Who is responsible for the murders carried out by the creature? And which sins are we being warned about? The hubris of science, the failure of paternal care, or the dangers of playing God? I'm Dr. John, and today we're taking a look at what Percy Shelley called one of the most original and complete productions of the age. And with the benefit of hindsight, we can call one of the founding texts in science fiction. Frankenstein's monster is a horrifying and endlessly fascinating creation. A human but not human, made of human parts and then rejected by its creator and eventually society. The creature looms large in adaptations and in the psyche. Before aliens, before zombies, there was the creature. But I would like to look at how the creature operates as a mirror. As all good science fiction, Frankenstein's monster is a reflection on humanity. Despite being about a monster, Frankenstein is really a novel about us, what humanity is, and how humanity is achieved. And the way it does it is pure genius. When we read a novel, we often yearn to imaginatively align ourselves to the hero, the discoverer, the adventurer. But Frankenstein is no hero. Mary Shelley crafted a novel in which we are compelled to consider the plight of the monster. First, some quick background. In the cold, wet summer of 1816, caused by a volcanic winter, the 19-year-old Mary Godwin accompanied her lover and soon-to-be husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, to Geneva. There they spent time with Lord Byron, and in the dark, wet evening of the 14th of June, they embarked on a competition to write a ghost story. It took Mary a few days to come up with something, but by the 16th of June, she'd found herself lying awake at the thought of a scientist attempting to reanimate the put-together corpse of what would become a monster. On the encouragement of Shelley, Mary worked on the story for the next year, with Shelley himself editing some of the manuscript, and it was published anonymously in January of 1818. Now hailed as a seminal work that energized both Gothic and Romantic literature, and is a likely contender for the origin of science fiction, the novel poses deep philosophical questions about what it means to be human, the bounds of science and experimentation, and mankind's use of powers that breach the normal bounds of ethics and morality, all highly relevant in today's landscape of AI and robotics. Mary Godwin, who became Shelley, had unconventional parents. Her father was a political philosopher who, among other things, wrote that in an advanced society marriage should be abolished. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a proto-feminist writer who had had a child out of wedlock, the child eventually raised by Mary's father as her stepsister. Wollstonecraft also wrote that marriage, if it exists at all, should be a meeting of equals, and she died soon after giving birth to Mary. So Mary was raised by her father and given access to a lot of philosophical thought and literature. By 16, she'd fallen in love with a married 21-year-old poet Percy Shelley. They met in secret at her mother's grave, and she eventually married him. So, quickly, the plot. Victor Frankenstein is the son of a wealthy merchant family, which affords him the opportunity to indulge his passions in first alchemy and the occult, and eventually the sciences, becoming self-taught in things like natural philosophy. He has two great loves in his life, his best friend Henry Clerval, and the girl that his parents foster, Elizabeth, who he will later marry. He attends university, and armed with ideas about chemistry and electricity, he decides to attempt to create a superhuman being. He reasons that in order to get to life, you must start with death. So he collects remains from graveyards and animates the creature which comes to life. Frankenstein is horrified and rejects the creature when it comes to him. The creature runs away and discovers a family, the de Lacys, watches them, discovers fire, learns language, finds a copy of Milton's Paradise Lost and some Goethe, learns to read, while hiding in a hovel observing the family. The creature saves a young girl from drowning, but is shot by her father, who interprets it as an attack. Now, angry at humanity, the creature happens upon Victor's brother, who he kills. He lures Victor to the frozen sea at Mont Blanc, where he tries to cut a deal. The creature tells Victor about his life and says that he will seek no more vengeance if Victor makes him a female companion. There are a lot of allusions to Paradise Lost here and the making of Eve for Adam. So Frankenstein makes a female creature, but again, is so horrified that he destroys the female creature in front of the monster's eyes. So the monster takes vengeance by killing poor Clerval. Depressed, Victor returns to Geneva and marries, but the creature appears again and murders Elizabeth on their wedding night. The bitterness escalates to the point where Victor chases the creature to the Arctic, where he eventually dies of exhaustion, and the creature mourns the death of his creator. The creature himself disappears into the darkness and distance. On its publication, the novel bore both a subtitle, The Modern Prometheus, and a quote from Paradise Lost. Prometheus was the titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to mankind. And the quote from Paradise Lost is a lament from Adam towards his creation. Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mould me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? The quote gives us a moment of reflection. The creature has not asked to be created, no more than Adam or Lucifer or any of us who are created by God. This plays into the notion that we're all in a predicament of creation here. We're subject to the creative processes of our forebears. And from the outset, we're being asked to consider the position of the created creature and not the creator. Critical reaction to the novel was mixed. Some found the novel devoid of moral teaching. The novelist Sir Walter Scott celebrated it, but put forward the idea that it had been written by Percy Shelley, an idea that has persisted, though modern scholarship is clear that the manuscript housed in the Bodleian at Oxford is written in Mary's hand, with notes and edits being made by Percy. Around 4,000 words are his, of a total 72,000. The novel begins with a recounting of Victor's childhood, and we're told of a privileged and loving childhood, with memories of mother's tender caress and father's benevolent smile. We're also told of how his mother took in an orphan girl, Elizabeth, who had been born of a noble family and yet found herself living destitute with another family. She's even called a poor creature. And how his mother's love and nurturing of Elizabeth enabled her to grow from this humble beginning to her obvious potential. In the original edition of the novel, the girl is Frankenstein's cousin, but in the later 1831 edition, Mary Shelley changed so that they're not related. This is all, of course, in complete contrast to the creature's genesis, which involved rejection, abandonment, and disgust. The implication here is that had Victor been Victoria, a female extension of his mother's compassion, the creature could have been loved and nurtured. The alternative story of the monster who was loved is implied in the negative space around this novel. And it's in this negative space that we can sense the influence of one of Mary Shelley's favourite philosophers, Rousseau. Rousseau urged that far from being born in sin, we are born essentially good and corrupted by society. The creature is kept constantly from that which he most desires: family, society, friendship, and love. And in turn, he determines to keep Victor similarly held, poised on the brink of having what he wants, but tormented by the snatching away of his hopes for happiness. So Frankenstein is a novel about what could have been. It's a train racing across the landscape of a cold and frozen Europe, which is constantly given the wrong turn at every junction. While it could be said that the hubris and scientific bravado of Victor Frankenstein is the main problem, the thing that he regrets is the dark knowledge he has acquired that he cannot now unknow. Equally, it can be argued that it is his decision-making that's at fault. Like Adam and Eve, who acquired carnal knowledge and were cast out of the Garden of Eden, once the knowledge of how to create life has been gained, cannot be unknown. But equally, once life has been generated, as his own upbringing should have shown him, the emotional commitment to foster that life is the moral obligation. Mary Shelley had lost her own first child when she conceived of this novel, a book she later called a hideous progeny. And the span of the book covers roughly 9 months from the creation of the creature to Victor Frankenstein's demise, the period of human gestation. This is a horror story of maternity. One of the sins of Frankenstein is that he corrupted the natural order of creation by making a man the creator. Frankenstein transgresses against the female principle of creating life. This has given feminist critics, those who read the novel with an eye to gender, lots of scope for analysis. There are some excellent feminist readings of the novel, much of which have been expertly summarized by Rosie Whitcomb on her channel Books and Cats. Rosie also analyzes the theme of slavery in the novel, and I think argues persuasively for the creature being a representation of both race and slave, noting that the book was written as the question of slavery was being fiercely debated, a subject we know that Mary and Percy Shelley took a very keen interest in. Rosie also argues that Victor's decision to destroy the creature's female companion, a misogynistic act in itself, is prompted by his concerns over the risk that the female creature may mix with humans and contaminate humanity, a concern he did not have when he was creating the creature. This gendered racism noted by her is a good argument, well made, but it's also true that the creature was not created male in a strict sense. As a blended being comprising of various remains, the creature does not emerge as an unequivocal he until its treatment at the hands of society gendered the creature by instilling a violent and vengeful nature in him. It is interesting that the creature is composed of a number of body parts and not one animated corpse. I think Shelley had an interest in the creature being a nameless and identityless other, centered as a kind of summa totalis, a sum total of humanity. The creature is an abstract manifestation of life, not a single person, amalgamation perhaps of living parts, kind of a tabula rasa, a blank slate ready to be submitted to the kinds of social forces that Rousseau discussed. Rather than create a monster wholly from animal, insect, or plant life, Shelley's creature is, I think, intentionally human-like, and largely comprised of human matter, a kind of near-human who is also no one in particular, a Nemo. And it's fitting that the creature doesn't die in a blaze of infamous glory, but rather disappears into the darkness and distance in the closing pages of the novel, as if merging back into the world from which it had emerged, as if it could be distilled from you or I, sharing our humanness with our familiar smells and shared corporeal reality, then to resolve, dilute back into the background. At the heart of the novel is an ethical question. Who is responsible for the creature's actions? Really, we only have three options. The creature himself, who goes on a murderous rampage despite reading Milton and Goethe. Victor, the irresponsible creator who rejects his creation. Or wider society, for failing to look past their own prejudices and driving the creature to isolation and revenge. While Rosie, in her excellent essay, lays the blame mostly at Victor's door, I want to explore the ethical implications of how the creature became isolated and represents a crisis of identity. And to do that, I need to go to an unusual place. I need to go to the scene of a real-world horror during the Second World War. In 1940, the young French Jewish philosopher Emmanuel Levinas was captured and detained by the Nazis, and his experience at the hands of his monstrous captors at Stalag 11B formed much of his later philosophy on the monstrous and on otherness. Central to his thinking was a burning question. How does the self come into being? From where does humanity, the ethical self, emerge? And how is it lacking in some? He surmised that there is a state of being without ethics and without true selfhood, a monstrous existence he calls the ilia, meaning there is. For Levinas, ethics, the good will towards others, and selfhood are closely linked. Without ethics, the self is undeveloped and reduces both the I and the you to just objects. Noticing the treatment meted out by camp guards, he noticed a failure to really see the other. His conclusion is only in the face-to-face connection with the other that the self comes into being. It's generated by the force of our ethical responsibility to the other. For Levinas, the self is not the originator of ethics, but rather ethics, the responsibility we feel towards others, in the seeing of them as individuals, not to kill or harm them, is the true birthplace of the self. In the crucial moment of the face-to-face encounter with the other, it's the ethical impulse that precedes thought, precedes self, and precedes identity. For Levinas, it is not "I think, therefore I am," but rather "I am responsible, therefore I am." In other words, we don't own our selfhood. It's shaped and formed by our encounters with others. The creature was created physically by Victor, but upon being rejected, attempts to create for himself a kind of psychology by reading Milton and Goethe in the hovel and observing the de Lacy family in their cabin, and tries to be framed socially by those he encounters who also reject him. Looking at the novel from the perspective of Levinas and his face-to-face encounter, all we see around us is a crisis of selfhood. We could think of the monster as a large wound, where the idea of subjectivity and identity is in crisis, since nothing is actually his. Everything is borrowed in the monster. I'll put a link in the description to their work, and with all the other quotations in this video essay. Despite his attempts to become a humane being, reading and showing compassion and generosity to the de Lacy family, the creature is prevented from fully developing a humane self while hiding in his hovel, because the self isn't built from self-knowledge, but from our ethical obligation towards others. It's therefore contingent upon our relations with others, not our seclusion from them. The idea of becoming a hermit to find yourself is, for Levinas, a fool's errand. When the creature adopts a hermit-like existence and is in his hovel reading Milton and Goethe and watching the de Lacy family, he is effectively in something like a womb, and he undergoes a kind of development. Othoniel Rosa describes this as he suffers his first auto-identification and individuality through reading Milton and Goethe. But this identity is fragile and nascent. The creature is a fragmented identity, patched together from his reading and simple observations, housed within a fragmented body, which is patched together from different body parts. As Kant observed what he called the paradox that must have struck everyone, we can't know ourselves. The reason Kant gives for this is because in the act of trying to see ourselves, we appear to ourselves only as an object in the world, and crucially not as a subject. We can only endow the gift of selfhood upon others, and in so doing, we also give it to ourselves. What the creature really needs in order to fully develop is to be seen and to see others. He needs Levinas's face-to-face. Remember, for Levinas, true humanity begins when we recognize the face of another person as sacred, something that cannot be reduced to a concept or a category or a use. The ethical recognition of the needs of the other is not only an obligation for us, but it's how we as selves come into being. The face-to-face is a saturated phenomena, a sacred interaction from which ethics and selfhood can flow. One of Emmanuel Levinas' students, Jean-Luc Marion, explains why this face-to-face is so vital. When we look at another's face, the attention tends towards the eyes. And in the eyes, the attention goes towards the pupil. And in the pupil, we see a void, an absence of anything objective. We only see a dark void from which an invisible gaze looks back at us. The only thing we can see in the voids of the pupils is whether or not we ourselves are being seen. For Marion, if we want to know about another person, we should look at their manner, look at what they do with their hands, where they focus their attention. All the things that the creature did, silently observing from the hovel, the de Lacy family, gathering wood and eating together. But if we want to know ourselves, we must look to the pupils of the other, the voids. For there, we can see if we are seen. In looking at a person's actions, we look with intention, but when we look at another person's eyes, our intention is not to see something. Our intention is to see whether, through those two black holes, he or she sees me. I wonder whether he's focusing on me. This may seem like an abstract philosophical knot, but I believe that the act of seeing and being seen, and the implications this has on selfhood, is key to Frankenstein. Because faces and eyes in the novel are always significant. The novel uses the face as an indication of goodness. Victor's sister, stroke cousin, stroke friend, stroke wife, Elizabeth, is saved from poverty because of her fair complexion, her hazel eyes, expressive, great mildness. She's taken from her hovel and away from the dark-eyed, hardy little vagrants whose faces do not resemble nobility. Throughout the novel, the face, especially the eyes, are indicative of goodness and images of the soul. But no one really sees the creature's face. Victor claims no mortal could support the horror of that countenance. In their first conversation in the mountains, the creature covers Victor's eyes so that he cannot see his face and listens only to his voice. His brother William covers the creature's eyes with his hands in their murderous encounter. When the captain of the Arctic expedition, Walton, sees the creature, he involuntarily closes his eyes and will not look at his face. The creature cannot even look at his own reflection. How was I terrified when I viewed myself in a transparent pool? At first I started back, unable to believe that it was indeed I who was reflected in the mirror. In fact, the only person to show hospitality to the creature is the blind old man de Lacy. Following the logic of the novel that the face is an indicator of the person within, no one can see the creature's inside. He feels within himself there is a nascent goodness, but they will not see it. I have good dispositions, he says. My life has been hitherto harmless and in some degree beneficial, but a fatal prejudice clouds their eyes, and where they ought to see a feeling and kind friend, they behold only a detestable monster. The creature and his fractured identity is the result of the failure of a genuine face-to-face. The problem of the schism between the creature and humans is reduced down to a problem of the eyes. They will not look at me. It is this failure to encounter him and to look at him that puts the creature beyond the normal order of human connection. It's also the failure of the face-to-face that prohibits anyone from having an ethical regard for the creature, and in so doing, following Levinas, their humanity towards him is prevented. He becomes objectified, a thing rather than a being. Recalling the atrocities of the Nazi guards in the prison camp, Levinas claimed that by failing to really see the faces and the eyes of their victims, the guards were prevented from seeing them as human. Like the guards, it is those who fail to really see the creature who suffer because of this refusal, reducing them in their humanity and reducing the creature to an ilia, a being without being. As one critic noted, the creature becomes like a disembodied non-being, retreating further and further into obscurity. The monster, too, only ever appears in the process of his disappearing, through his traces, scattered linguistically in mountain faces and in the print of his huge step on the white plain and inscriptions. Thus, the creature who began as a being with the potential to be a human blank slate becomes increasingly faceless, monstrous, and other than human. He may have been composed of body parts and figured as a human in form. He may have learned Milton's poetry and shown glimpses of humanity and compassion, but through the failure of anyone to behold his face, the creature becomes increasingly monstrous, until at the end he merges with the distant darkness and the waves, as if from the grave he was born, and to the violent and unpredictable forces of nature he returns. Just as the face of the other calls for an ethical response, the creature's existence and suffering demand recognition. However, Victor's failure to embrace this responsibility and the widespread failure to see the creature's face leads to the horror of the ilia becoming the dominant force in the narrative. Victor sinned by playing God and creating a body, but I think the greater sin was in the combined failure to allow the creature to become a humane self, a failure of seeing. Shelley uses the creature's plight to critique misrecognition, prejudice, and social and political injustices. The creature's eloquent arguments for his own humanity are consistently dismissed due to his appearance, a failure of seeing I think we can learn from. And the implied lesson here is that it is our responsibility as a society to subjectify others, to see them, and to be seen by them. Failing to do so reduces us to beings with inhibited and constrained selves, beings without being, objectifying others, and slowly ourselves in the process. Monstrosity runs throughout Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and is not solely an attribute of the creature. The creature serves to remind us of the danger of our own propensity to be monstrous, because the power to endow selfhood on others and on ourselves is in the act of seeing. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't hesitate to like, comment and subscribe. And if you'd like to join the channel, you can click join below. You'll be supporting this channel, which is hugely appreciated and will contribute to further videos. Thanks for watching.